If you walk through the old quarters of Paris or drive through the rural villages of France today, you will see something strange written in the stone itself. You will see beautiful old buildings where the windows have been filled in with solid bricks. It looks like an architectural mistake or a scar from a war, but it is actually the physical evidence of one of the deadliest taxes in human history, a tax that literally forced the poor to live in the dark and sold them sunlight by the square inch. This is Tom from the Collapse Log exploring the rise and fall of empires, because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. We often imagine the Napoleonic era as a time of blinding glory. We think of the sun of Austerlitz shining down on the emperor's legions. We think of the gold braid on the uniforms and the glittering ballrooms of the empire. But empires are expensive things to run, and behind the facade of military triumph, the French state was desperate for cash. The wars of the Revolution had drained the treasury dry. The old tax system of the monarchy had collapsed in the fires of 1789. The government needed a way to tax the population without triggering another revolution. They needed a tax that was easy to collect, difficult to evade, and theoretically fair. So in 1798, the Directory, which was the government just before Napoleon took over, introduced a new law called the Impôt sur les portes et fenêtres, the tax on doors and windows. On paper, the logic was seductive and almost beautiful in its simplicity. It was designed to be a progressive tax on the wealthy. The reasoning went like this. Rich people live in large chateaux and grand urban mansions. These buildings have dozens of large windows and doors. Poor people live in small cottages or tiny garrets. These buildings have very few windows. Therefore, if you tax the number of openings in a building, you are effectively taxing the wealth of the owner without having to invade their privacy, to count their furniture or their income. It seemed like the perfect solution. It respected the privacy of the citizen because the tax collector never had to enter the house. He could simply walk down the street, count the holes in the wall, and write out the bill. It was efficient, it was rational, it was fair. But economists and historians have a saying that echoes through the ages. You get what you incentivize. And if you tax something, you get less of it. When the French state decided to tax windows, they thought they were taxing architectural luxury. But they were actually taxing light. They were taxing fresh air. They were taxing the very biological necessities of human life. The reaction of the French population was immediate and rational. If the government was going to charge them for every hole in the wall, they would simply have fewer holes. Almost overnight, the architecture of France changed. When a peasant built a new farmhouse, he stopped building for comfort and started building for tax evasion. He would build a solid stone box with a single door and maybe one tiny aperture for ventilation. If he was feeling extravagant, he might add a single small window on the south side. But the days of light-filled cottages were over. But the real tragedy happened in the existing buildings. Landlords in cities like Paris and Lyon and Marseille realized that their tax bill was based on the current state of the facade. It didn't matter if the building was 200 years old. If it had 10 windows, you paid for 10 windows. So a massive wave of renovation began across the country, but it was a renovation of destruction. Landlords hired masons not to open up spaces, but to seal them shut. They took beautiful area apartments and bricked up half the windows. They took corridors that had once been lit by the sun and turned them into dark tunnels. In the tenement blocks where the poor lived, the situation became horrific. A landlord might decide that a room only needed one window instead of two, or perhaps no window at all if it opened onto a courtyard. Families found themselves living in spaces that were essentially caves. Napoleon Bonaparte came to power just a year after this tax was introduced. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a man of science. You might think that he would see the absurdity of taxing sunlight. You might think he would repeal it, but Napoleon was also a pragmatist who was fighting a total war against the rest of Europe. He needed money. He needed millions of francs to pay for the muskets and the cannons and the boots of the Grand Army. The window tax was incredibly efficient. It brought in a steady stream of revenue that was easy to forecast and easy to collect. So Napoleon did not repeal the tax. He embraced it. He made it a cornerstone of the French fiscal system, and as his armies marched across Europe, he brought the tax with him like a virus. When he conquered the Netherlands, he looked at the tall, narrow houses of Amsterdam and saw a gold mine. The Dutch loved their large windows. They loved light. Napoleon imposed the window tax on the Dutch territories. If you go to the Netherlands today, you can still see the evidence. The Dutch call it the blocked window. You can walk along the canals and see 17th century houses where entire vertical rows of windows have been bricked up. That is not a stylistic choice. That is the ghost of the French tax collector. He did the same in Italy. He did the same in parts of Germany. The darkness was one of France's primary exports during the Empire. But the consequences of this policy went far beyond ugly architecture. The consequences were biological. To understand why we have to look at the medical reality of the 19th century. This was an era before antibiotics. It was an era before modern sanitation. The cities of Europe were crowded and dirty. The two great killers of the poor were tuberculosis and rickets. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that attacks the lungs. It thrives in damp, dark, stagnant air. Sunlight is a natural disinfectant. Ultraviolet rays kill the tuberculosis bacteria. Fresh air flow dilutes the concentration of the germs and stops the spread of infection. Rickets is a disease caused by a lack of vitamin D. It causes the bones of children to become soft and weak, leading to bowed legs and stunted growth. The primary source of vitamin D for the human body is exposure to sunlight. By taxing windows, the French state effectively created a laboratory for these diseases. Imagine a working-class family in Paris in 1810. They live in a single room on the 4th floor of a tenement in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Before the tax, the room might have had 2 windows looking out onto the street. It would have had a cross breeze. It would have had patches of sunlight on the floor where the children could play. But the landlord wants to save money. He bricks up one window completely. He narrows the other one to a slit. The room becomes a dark, damp box. The air never changes. The moisture from the cooking and the washing and the breathing of 5 or 6 people stays trapped in the room. The walls run with condensation. Mold begins to grow in the corners. When one family member gets a cough, the bacteria hangs in the stagnant air. It doesn't get blown away. It settles in the lungs of the children. The children themselves rarely see the sun. They work in dark factories during the day and come home to a dark room at night. Their bones do not harden. They grow up twisted and frail. Doctors at the time began to notice this. It wasn't a secret. The medical profession wrote angry letters to the government. They called the window tax the tax on hygiene. They argued that the state was killing its own future soldiers and workers. They pointed out the bitter irony. Napoleon was obsessed with public health in the army. He was the first general to vaccinate his troops against smallpox. He understood the importance of hygiene in the camp. But in the cities of France, his tax policy was creating a public health catastrophe. The impact on the physical stature of the French population was measurable. We know from military conscription records that the height of the average French recruit dropped during the 19th century. There were many causes for this, including malnutrition and the genetic loss of so many tall men in the wars. But the lack of sunlight and the prevalence of rickets played a significant role. France was literally shrinking. And yet the tax remained. It remained because the state becomes addicted to revenue. Once a tax is on the books, it is incredibly hard to remove. It becomes part of the budget. It pays for the salaries of the bureaucrats. It pays for the interest on the national debt. To repeal the window tax, the government would have had to find that money somewhere else. They would have had to tax the land or the income of the rich more heavily, and the rich had political power. The poor, who were dying of tuberculosis in the dark, did not, so the tax stayed. It survived Napoleon. It survived the restoration of the monarchy. It survived the Second Empire. It survived the Third Republic. In fact, it wasn't fully abolished in France until 1926. For 128 years, the French government discouraged its citizens from having windows. Think about that. The tax survived the discovery of the germ theory of disease. It survived the discoveries of Louis Pasteur. It survived the entire Industrial Revolution. Generations of French architects were trained to design buildings that minimized light. It created a specific style of urban gloom. If you read the novels of Victor Hugo or Émile Zola, the descriptions of the housing of the poor are always focused on the darkness. In Les Miserables, Hugo writes about the Gorbeau tenement. He describes it as a place where the day never enters. He wasn't just using a metaphor for poverty. He was describing the literal reality of tax-efficient housing. Hugo himself was a fierce critic of the tax. He famously said, "Dear God, you give the air to men and the law sells it to them." But the bureaucrats had their arguments too. They argued that the tax was voluntary. No one forced you to brick up your window. You were free to have as much light as you wanted as long as you could pay for it. And this is the cold logic of the technocrat. It ignores the reality of poverty. For a family living on the edge of starvation, paying an extra few francs a year for a second window was not a choice. It was an impossibility. The window tax created a strange class divide. Light became a luxury good. You could tell how rich a person was by how bright their living room was. The wealthy lived in the sun, the poor lived in the shadow. It also created a bizarre game of cat and mouse between the tax collectors and the population. The tax collectors became despised figures. They were known as the cellar rats or the peeping toms. They would prowl the streets with notebooks scanning the facades of houses. People tried to cheat the system. They would camouflage windows. They would build fake walls. They would argue that a specific hole was not a window but a ventilation shaft, which was taxed at a lower rate. This led to absurd legal definitions. The government had to issue decrees defining exactly what a window was. They argued about whether a hole covered with oiled paper counted as a window. They argued about skylights. They argued about holes in the door. There were cases where people were taxed for having a hole in their wall that they used to throw out wastewater. The most tragic aspect of this story is that France was not the only one. Britain had a window tax too. In fact, the British invented it before the French, and in Britain it had the same horrific effects. In London and Edinburgh, the poor lived in cellars without any natural light at all because cellar windows were taxed. It was only after massive public outcry and medical campaigns that Britain repealed its tax in 1851. France held on for another 75 years. Why? Why did France keep this self-destructive policy for so long? Part of it was the legacy of Napoleon. He had built a centralized administrative state that was incredibly resistant to change. The machinery of the French state was designed to extract resources to feed the center. But it also speaks to a quiet decay in the mindset of the ruling class. They saw the population not as a resource to be nurtured, but as a resource to be harvested. They looked at a house, and they didn't see a home. They saw a taxable asset. They didn't see a family needing health. They saw a revenue unit. This kind of thinking is dangerous. It is the kind of thinking that brings down empires from the inside. When a state values its balance sheet more than the biological viability of its people, it has entered a terminal decline. The window tax is a perfect example of how a golden age can hide a rotting core. On the surface, France in the 19th century was booming. Paris was being rebuilt by housemen. The boulevards were wide. The opera houses were full. But behind the limestone facades in the courtyards and the alleys, the darkness was killing the people. The quiet decay wasn't in the budget. The budget looked fine. The decay was in the lungs of the workers. It was in the bones of the children. And eventually, that bill comes due. A sick population cannot fight wars. A sick population cannot innovate. A sick population breeds resentment and revolution. The window tax contributed to the social unrest that plagued France throughout the 19th century. The people knew that the system was rigged against them. They knew that the very air they breathed was being measured and sold. It is a lesson that resonates today. We look at our own tax codes and our own regulations. We think they are rational. We think they are fair. But we should always ask, what are the unintended consequences? What are we incentivizing people to do? Are we incentivizing them to be healthier or sicker? Are we incentivizing them to build better homes or worse ones? The bricked-up windows of France are a warning. They are silent monuments to the stupidity of smart men. They tell us that you can be efficient, and you can be profitable, and you can still be horribly wrong. Napoleon thought he was funding an empire. In reality, he was funding a plague. He traded the health of his nation for a few extra barrels of gold. And the irony is that the sunlight he taxed was the one thing that could have saved them. If you go to a museum in Paris, you might see the grand portraits of the era. You see the velvet and the silk. You see the power. But next time, look at the background. Look for the windows. And remember the millions of people who were erased from the picture because they were living in the dark. Remember the families who had to make the choice between bread and light. And remember that the most dangerous taxes are not the ones that take your money. They are the ones that take your humanity. The window tax was repealed almost a century ago, but in many rural areas the bricks remain. It costs money to reopen a window. It costs money to fix the masonry. So the scars stay there. They are a persistent reminder that bad policy leaves a mark that can last for generations. The French houses with no windows are not just architectural oddities. They are the tombstones of a golden age that lost its way. They are the proof that when you try to monetize nature, nature eventually fights back. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. The sun always rises, but that doesn't matter if you have built a wall to keep it out. History is filled with walls we built ourselves, and usually we built them because someone told us it was the price of civilization.